So what's up, folks? I'm here to talk about The Witcher 3, or at least that crazy flame war going on out there between the Sony fanboys and the Xbox fanboys. Right before the release of The Witcher 3, I think a few months before, CD Projekt Red said, hey, we're not going to be able to hit 1080p on the Xbox One full time, but we're going to use something called dynamic resolution or dynamic scaling. And what that does is that where it's able to play at 1080p, the game will play at 1080p, and once other resources come into the game, Xbox will drop down to 900p. Which a lot of games on the Xbox One that play at 900p, and that's for a reason. And this is where it's kicking these people in the butt right now. These fanboys. When a developer's making a game for the Xbox One, Microsoft does have some requirements that they put in place, some things that they ask. And one of the things that Microsoft always wants on their console is good frame rates. And they've been doing that since the Xbox 360. The PlayStation 3 was supposed to be so much superior than the Xbox 360, yet the majority of the games on the Xbox 360 play smoother and better because of the frame rates. People didn't pay attention to that. It was like, hey, we got Blu-ray, so whatever. Sony came out with this hype. They hyped their system 1080p, but along the way, they forgot about frame rates. And if you've been a console gamer all your life and that's all you've ever done, you might not notice, the difference in frame rates that much. You might not even care about them that much. And I was the same way. It wasn't until recently, as I've been playing more PC games, especially over the last 2 years. I have been after playing PC games at 60 frames per second, and of course there are some console games that play 60 frames per second. Call of Duty, Forza Motorsport 5, but there's very few that do. Once you've been playing 60 frames per second for a while, or above that frame rate, but at least locked at 60 frames per second, it's kind of hard to go back to console gaming because not only does it look better and it's easier on the eyes, but it gives the game some sort of a hyper realism to the game. Believable 60 frames per second, smoother. It's easier to get sucked into the game at 60 frames per second, and most importantly, your gaming is much better at 60 frames per second. Why? Because you have more frames in between inside that 1 second. So you can see and move faster, see things coming your way a little bit faster than if you were playing 30 frames per second. So with all that being said, Sony forgot about, frame rates being important, I guess, in their gaming console. We want every game to be 1080p regardless, because that's what our gamers want. That's what we put in their heads, to believe that 1080, and 1080, don't get me wrong, 1080p is my standard on PC as far as resolution. For performance and gameplay, so is frames per second. So this is where they're getting in trouble with The Witcher 3. The Witcher 3 on the PlayStation 4 plays 1080p natively at all times. The problem with that is the PlayStation is having a hard time keeping up. Originally, when the game came out, the PlayStation 4 version of the game is locked at 30 frames per second, right? So, and if it drops 4 or 5 frames per second, like say it drops from 30 to 25, the game will actually lock it down at 20 frames per second. You know what 20 frames per second is like this? The choppiness right there. Okay, so that started to happen in The Witcher 3 on the PlayStation 4. Now on the Xbox, they have frame rate issues, but they were a little bit different. The frame rate wasn't locked on the Xbox One, so in some scenes it will go above 30 frames per second. It created some issues. It doesn't necessarily look better because you have more frames. Now more frames is better, but it's more frames at a lock because it creates that smoothness. PlayStation 4 is locked, and if it drops down to 20. Problem is that once it dropped down to 20, it would stay locked there. And sometimes it wouldn't go back up, it would stay there. And that was a problem. This is why they released a patch so quickly. Or, the Xbox One, sometimes going above the 30 frames per second, did drop down, to the 27, 25 frames per second. Just deploy this update to help performance. So what they did, they unlock it on the PlayStation 4. They unlocked that 20 frames per second lock. Once it drops down to, say, if it drops down to 21, as soon as it is able to, it'll come back up to 30 frames per second. And they did something similar on the Xbox One where they just locked it at 30, so it doesn't go above 30, right? And then they improve performance below 30. So if the game drops below 30 frames per second, as soon as it can, it comes back up. So the problem with this is that the Xbox has dynamic scaling. So the Xbox says, hey, 1080p, I'm running out of resources right here. You got all this stuff, all this magic and monsters and all kinds of bullshit on the screen going. So the Xbox One said, hey, I'm running out of resources. Let's scale it down to 900p. Which honestly, on a television, you're barely gonna notice that change in resolution. Unless you're in front of your screen like this, or you're on a 50-inch screen, you're not gonna notice that much. So it all depends on the quality of your screen too. 900p is not that far below 1080p. Now the PlayStation 4, so what's happening is that with the patches, the performance, the locking of the frame rates were made exactly the same on both consoles. But because the Xbox One knows when, is able to downscale to 900p, it does that to maintain a better frame rate. So the Xbox said, hey, I'm dropping frame rate, this is not good. Let's just scale down things slowly. And it goes down slowly back to 900p. Going to PC gaming, you won't have to argue.